Most of Europe has agreed to help the U.S. and Israel in their war against Iran, with one notable exception.
Spain has been terrible.
The president is threatening Spain with sanctions. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. Also today, Lebanon has been dragged into the fighting.
Hezbollah's actions were quite hasty, to say the least, and they've exposed Lebanon to a strategic disaster.
And winning the cyber war with Iran is all about getting your message out first.
Early on, there is this information void, a heightened demand for knowing what's going on, and a scarcer supply.
Also in Nepal, Gen Z voters could be kingmakers in this week's elections. And 3 men are arrested in the UK on charges of spying for China.
Today, here on The World. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. No relief on this 5th day of the U.S. and Israel's war against Iran. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth announced this morning that a U.S. submarine sank an Iranian warship in international waters. He said the two countries are hitting Iran while it's down and, quote, that's the way it should be.
And as President Trump said, more and larger waves are coming. We are just getting started. We are accelerating, not decelerating.
Also today, an Israeli fighter plane shot down an Iranian jet over Tehran. So far, the war has killed more than 1,000 people in Iran. The death toll in Lebanon has risen to about 72 people and around a dozen in Israel, according to officials in those countries. 6 U.S. service members have died.
Oil prices have soared following Iranian attacks on ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. Those attacks have sent global stocks tumbling. Henry Wong is president of the Center for China and Globalization. He spoke with CBS News.
President Trump is doing self-harm as well because it hurts European countries, it hurts all G7 countries, it hurts the U.S. as well. So the whole economy is coming down, and then that's going to affect everybody.
That fact is not being lost on world leaders whose countries have been affected by the war. While on a visit to Australia, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney told journalists that he supports the war, but with regret, because he calls it another example of the failure of the international order.
Despite decades of UN Security Council resolutions, the tireless work of the International Atomic Energy Agency, and the succession of sanctions and diplomatic frameworks, Iran's nuclear threat remains. And now, the United States and Israel have acted without engaging the United Nations or consulting allies, including Canada.
Europe has, by and large, rallied behind the U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran, even as some leaders question the legality of the action. So far, only one country has outright condemned it, Spain. This has angered President Trump, who is now threatening Spain with economic sanctions. The World's Jerry Haddon begins our coverage today from Barcelona.
Prime Minister Sanchez was swift in condemning the Iran attacks and in sending out his foreign minister to double down on his stance. José Manuel Álvarez told reporters Monday that the U.S. will under no circumstances use its bases in our sovereign territory for actions that violate our existing treaties or international norms under the UN Charter. The United States has 2 military installations in Spain's south, an Air Force base in Morón, and a naval facility in Brota along Spain's Atlantic coast. They're Cold War bases built back in the 1950s. They've long served as refueling and logistics points in support of conflicts elsewhere. Spain's ban on using them in the Iran war has not gone down well in Washington.
Spain has been terrible.
This was President Donald Trump warming up yesterday.
And now Spain actually said that we can't use their bases, and that's all right. We could use their base if we want. We could just fly in and use it. Nobody's going to tell us not to use it, but we don't have to.
The U.S. has moved at least 15 military aircraft from Spain since the weekend to other bases. As the aircraft took off, so did the bilateral tension.
I could tomorrow stop, or today, even better, stop everything having to do with Spain. All business having to do with Spain. I have the right to stop it. Embargoes, do anything I want with it. And we may do that with Spain. What do you think?
That question was directed at some of Trump's cabinet members who were with him in the Oval Office, among them Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, who wholeheartedly agreed with the president Spain's Pedro Sanchez had his own answer.
Hace 23 años, otra administración estadounidense nos arrastró a una guerra en Oriente Medio.
23 years ago, a different U.S. administration dragged us into a war in the Middle East, Sanchez said, referring to the war in Iraq under then-President George W. Bush. It was a war, Sanchez said, that in theory was to eliminate Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction and guarantee global security. The result, he said, was the opposite. That war was wildly unpopular among Spaniards, even before Spain joined the so-called Coalition of the Willing in defiance of the United Nations. For weeks in 2003, protesters took to the streets across Spain, but then Prime Minister José María Aznar joined the fight anyway. Spain's backing for the U.S. inspired Islamic terrorists to set off bombs on trains across Madrid a year later, killing hundreds of commuters. A retrieved phone message from that day captured the horror. It was the deadliest attack ever on Spanish soil, and it led to Aznar's ouster. There are no official polls yet on how Spaniards feel about the Iran war, but the vast majority disapprove of Donald Trump in general. Outside a Barcelona restaurant, Vicent Laporta and Rafa Torrent are sipping on a couple of midday vermouths.
No, yo no quiero que participe para nada, y más en una guerra que es ilegal, que la...
I don't want Spain to enter this war or support it, Laporta says. First of all, it's completely illegal. All wars are bad, says Torrent. They started this just to raise prices on gas, oil, everything. Sanchez is well aware of this sentiment, as he was when he condemned Israel's war in Gaza and the U.S. regime change in Venezuela in January. These stances have put Spain at odds with its U.S. ally, but the consequences may not be as dire as Trump has made them sound this week. Today, European Commission Vice President for Prosperity and Industrial Strategy, Stéphane Séjourné, explained why as he came to Spain's defense.
Quiero ser muy claro en el aspecto comercial, cualquier amenaza.
Let me be clear, he said, on trade matters, any threat against one member state is a threat to the entire European Union. It's an issue for the entire bloc to deal with. Just as with the threats by Trump against Greenland's sovereignty, he said, we are united in our stance. So Sanchez seems confident he can weather Trump's verbal assaults, besides domestic attacks from Spain's own conservative political parties, and then in elections next year, profit from Spain's widespread anti-Trump sentiment. For The World, I'm Sherry Haddon, Barcelona.
The White House today claimed that Spain has agreed to cooperate with U.S. operations in the Mideast after Trump threatened financial penalties. A while later this afternoon, Spain's government denied that.
Coming up on the show, Israeli forces are back in southern Lebanon in response, they say, to rocket attacks carried out by Hezbollah. The Shia militant group in Lebanon is a major supporter of Iran.
I think Hezbollah's actions were quite hasty, to say the least, and they've exposed Lebanon to a strategic disaster.
Just ahead, how Lebanon has been dragged into another war. You're listening to The World.
I'm Carolyn Beeler. This is The World. In Cuba, food is scarce and power outages frequent as the island grapples with Washington's blockade of Venezuelan oil. This adds to the decades-long economic stagnation caused by the U.S. embargo and a rigid, state-controlled economic system. Ricardo Herrero, executive director of the Cuba Study Group, told me this afternoon that Cuba right now is in dire straits.
You have an electricity grid on the verge of complete collapse, with the island suffering repeated nationwide blackouts in some provinces 2 to 3 days in a row before they then have access to 1 hour's worth of electricity. Cubans are suffering significant food shortages. Many Cubans are making do today with one meal a day, and a very bare bones meal at that. So things are very difficult on the ground.
Things are bad. I want to dig into the changes that both Havana and Washington are saying they are supporting, starting with the moves Washington is making. The Trump administration has loosened the oil blockade on Venezuelan oil. Can you tell me what they have done and what impact that is having?
Well, it appears that there's a shipment of, I believe it's LPG, that's making its way from Venezuela to Cuba that the Trump administration is authorizing. What they did authorize last week was for private sector exporters in the United States and elsewhere to export petroleum-based products like gasoline, like diesel, directly to Cuban private sector entrepreneurs. So, in essence, the Trump administration has put the entire market for oil imports into Cuba in the hands of the private sector.
So, how much oil is getting to Cuba now? Is it a meaningful amount?
Right now, what you have is fuel that's mostly making it into Cuba right now. Things like gasoline, like diesel, which is what most cars operate on. Also, it's what you need to keep generators running, as well as water pumps. Water pumps in Cuba largely run on diesel. So that's what's mostly needed on the ground. This is the intent behind these measures is not to try to replace the current oil industry in Cuba through the private sector. It's to use the private sector to help alleviate the humanitarian crisis on the ground.
So, are all the pieces in place to allow a meaningful amount of oil to flow into Cuba through private companies?
Not yet. They've authorized now Cuban domestic private businesses to also import for their own use, but they're still not authorized to warehouse it or to sell it through state-owned pumps. So those roadblocks still need to be removed. And then also the other big bottleneck is that there are no banking rails between the United States and Cuba that allow for those private sector importers to remit direct payment to their suppliers abroad. They're doing it through informal channels, the same way that they've been paying for food imports. Most food imports today are in the hands of the private sector in Cuba. Because of the perceived political risk and the compliance risk, we've yet to see any U.S. banks move in to onboard that sector.
Do you have a sense if these roadblocks that you've mentioned are likely to be removed or overcome? Is this fix likely to bring any meaningful amount of oil into Cuba?
I do believe that anything that allows for these early moves to put this market in the hands of private sector actors, anything that allows that sector to scale up their operations so that you're basically building a new economy from the ground up in Cuba, it would help advance the policy of this administration and help a lot of people on the ground. So I think they're looking at all that. If and when it gets rolled out, it's hard to say, but I think they're trying to figure it out.
Washington's efforts to reach out to Cuba's private sector specifically could backfire and end up empowering its leaders. The Secretary of State Marco Rubio says he is guarding against that. Here's a comment he made in the last few days to reporters.
If we catch the private sector there playing games and diverting it to the regime or to the military company, if we find that they're moving that stuff around in ways that violate the spirit and the scope of these permissions, those licenses will be canceled.
Does the private sector in Cuba have enough clout to actually operate independently of the government?
They do. They do. The thing is, the private sector, it's a big and growing sector in the economy. There are some individuals, sons and daughters of the nomenclature or other folks with direct ties with the regime, that also are operating businesses in that private sector. I struggle to see at this moment that this administration would remove all authorizations that would just blanket cut off the sector as a whole from their ability to be able to import all sorts of necessary goods into the island. But I could certainly see them target particular individuals that may be operating in the sector but are otherwise under sanctions programs or otherwise prohibited under current U.S. law and regulation from engaging in any transactions with the United States. I imagine they'll be looking out for that.
I want to switch over now to what Havana is doing. Cuba's president called this week for an urgent transformation of the country's economic model. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, calling for greater autonomy of the private sector, for all sorts of measures to unlock productivity in the economy, to bring in foreign investment. All of these statements that were made by Díaz-Canel are not new.
Cuba's president, Díaz-Canel.
Correct. They're stating them with greater frequency and dialing up the volume to 11. But as in the past, we have yet to see real follow through or implementation of these reforms.
And you sound skeptical that real change will happen here.
I think the fundamental challenge that Cuba's political leaders face today is credibility. We've lived through decades now of reforms that are announced and then rolled out, only to then be backtracked or stalled because the leadership perceives that it threatens their control. They would have to offer some sort of assurances to make people believe that this time will be different and that they really do this time have the political will and administrative capacity to see these reforms through.
We're talking about this all within the context of the blockade of Venezuelan oil getting to Cuba. I'm wondering if Cuban leaders are taking lessons from what just happened in Venezuela, where the U.S. has taken over the management and sale of Venezuela's oil industry. Are they looking at their neighbor and thinking maybe it is actually time to enact some changes?
I would imagine that they're looking at what's happening in Venezuela and what's happening in Iran, and that there is growing and intensifying pressure internally to enact significant changes. The challenge is, can they reach political consensus within and align all the different factions within that state, party, and military apparatus in order to effectuate those changes? That's what they have shown in the past that they are not capable of doing. And given that it's the exact same people running the show that have been running the show now for, in some cases, decades, and have very little to show for it in terms of concrete results, it's hard to see the same people that dug this hole as deep as it is to be able to dig themselves out.
Ricardo Herrero is the executive director of the Cuba Study Group. Still ahead, Lebanon has been drawn into the Iran war as Hezbollah fires rockets into northern Israel. Coming up, we'll look at how people in Lebanon are faring. You are listening to The World.
This is The World. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. As the Israeli-U.S. war with Iran reverberates throughout the region, a proxy war has ignited in Lebanon.
In the past 24 hours, Israeli ground forces entered southern Lebanon, they say in response to attacks carried out by the Shia militant group Hezbollah. The death toll from Israeli airstrikes in Lebanon has risen to 72 people.
Iran has supported Hezbollah for years. The group says its attacks on Israel are in retaliation for Israel's war on Iran. The World's Shirin Jafari reports that people in Lebanon are nervous about another protracted war with their neighbor.
It was around 4 a.m. on Tuesday when Israeli bombs targeted the Comfort Hotel just outside of Beirut. Emergency services rushed to the scene. They carried the injured on stretchers. At least 11 people were killed. One woman sits in silence as a first aid responder bandages her bloody head. There's a look of shock on her face. In the southern parts of the country, Israeli jets carried out airstrikes on residential areas. Local reporters captured footage of the strikes. People in the area tell me that drones have continued to buzz overhead overnight. They could hear the roar of fighter jets and thuds of bombardment. The Israeli military has ordered people in dozens of villages in southern Lebanon to evacuate. The news of the evacuation order sent residents scrambling to leave the area. A video posted on social media shows cars lining up the highway. The UN Refugee Agency says around 30,000 people have been displaced. Some are staying in schools and shelters. Others sleep in their cars on the side of the road. Sami Halabi is with the Alternative Policy Institute, a think tank based in Beirut.
A lot of people are scared and are running. The problem is a lot of roads are closed, and so people are essentially trapped.
He says Lebanon was already devastated by the on and off conflicts with Israel, going as far back as decades. The latest was sparked by the October 7th attacks and Israel's response against Hamas and Hezbollah. A shaky ceasefire was holding, he says, despite regular violations by Israel.
But at least Hezbollah held its fire because, we didn't want to invite the kind of dynamics that we have now invited onto the country.
The Lebanese people have suffered the consequences of the conflicts between Hezbollah and Israel, he says. Israel's retaliation has been intense. It has killed Hezbollah's top leaders and many of its fighters. Israel was also behind the 2024 attacks, in which thousands of pagers and handheld devices belonging to the group's members exploded. 12 people were killed and around 1,500 people were injured in that incident, according to reports. Today, Hezbollah has once again brought war to Lebanon, says Halabi.
I think Hezbollah's actions were quite hasty, to say the least, and they've exposed Lebanon to a strategic disaster.
Halabi says the group has lost support even within its own base, given the level of death and destruction people have endured in recent years. As part of the ground incursion, Israeli troops entered the Lebanese town of Khiam, about 4 miles from the border. The Israeli military says this is part of a defensive move to counter any future Hezbollah attacks. For The World, I'm Shirin Jafari.
As war spreads across the Middle East, another battle is being fought online. Within minutes of the first bombings on Iran by joint U.S. and Israeli forces, people on X posted dramatic videos and images claiming to show attacks and damage. Many of those posts turned out to be misleading. They were old footage, AI-generated images, even video game clips. Experts say it is a familiar pattern, but this time more sophisticated tools are being deployed. The world's Tibi Isaiah looks at how misinformation thrives during war.
A viral video shows thousands of mourners carrying a coffin through a massive crowd. Online posts claimed it was the funeral of Iran's supreme leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. But fact-checkers traced it to a funeral in Lebanon last year for Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah. Another clip shows missiles streaking across the sky and a jet exploding. Some accounts said it was the Iranian forces shooting down an Israeli fighter jet. But the footage actually came from a military video game. Experts say misleading videos like these spread quickly during conflicts, sometimes faster than verified information. Daniel Silverman researches misinformation at Carnegie Mellon University.
So early on, after a conflict starts, there is this information void, a heightened demand for knowing what's going on, and a scarcer supply. So because of that demand-supply gap, it's very profitable to supply something that's going to grab a lot of attention.
Those posts can rack up millions of views, which often translate into revenue. But it's not only about clicks, Silverman says. It's also about shaping the narrative.
So in war, there are strong incentives to present yourself in the most favorable light, that you're winning, that you're doing no harm, and to present your opponents in the opposite light, right? That they're losing and getting trampled and they're doing all these horrible things, right?
And audiences often look for information that reinforces what they already believe, which can help misleading content spread even further. The people sharing it aren't always governments or coordinated campaigns. Often, it's ordinary users passing along dramatic images or warnings, sometimes without checking if they are real. Areas experiencing conflict are particularly vulnerable. The same pattern appeared last week in Mexico. After authorities announced the capture of cartel leader El Mencho, videos spread online showing passengers running through Guadalajara's airport. Although the panic was real, media outlets shared the viral videos without explaining what caused the panic, adding to the chaos and confusion. Hours later, a new image began circulating online, showing a commercial plane on fire at the airport. and messages spread that gunmen had seized the airport and tourists had been taken hostage. Investigators later found that video had been created using AI. Another AI video claiming to show fires in the resort city of Puerto Vallarta went viral as well. Researchers at Tec de Monterrey's Digital Media Observatory analyzed hundreds of misleading posts. Ana Maltos is part of the team.
Predominó mucha confusión y principalmente el miedo por encima.
She says the dominant emotions in the posts were fear and confusion, and that makes the content more likely to be shared with friends and family, sometimes simply to warn others. Gisela Pérez de Hacha is an open-source journalist in Mexico who investigates online misinformation. She says the job has become increasingly difficult because social media platforms have stopped fact-checking posts.
Elon Musk has made it really hard to do any disinformation research on X. You only have like a limited amount of data that you can download. So as a researcher, that has become really challenging.
Last year, Meta ended its third-party fact-checking system and shifted toward a community notes model where users can add context to posts. At the same time, Pérez de Hacha says artificial intelligence is making it easier and faster to create convincing images and videos.
But on the other hand, there's also a lot of new techniques and, AI detection software and stuff that can also make the verification process a little bit faster.
Still, one thing remains extremely difficult, she says, and that is identifying the original source of false content. Without access to data from social media companies or law enforcement, she says it's often impossible to prove where misleading information began. Experts say there are ways people can slow the spread of misinformation. Take a moment before sharing dramatic images or videos. Check the source of the content and look for confirmation from trusted sources. Sometimes the first line of defense against misinformation is simply choosing not to share it. For the World, I'm Tibisa Isea, Mexico City.
Police in the UK have arrested 3 men accused of spying for the Chinese government. Ratcheting up the intrigue, one of those arrested is a partner of a sitting member of parliament. Kerry Brown is the director of the Lao China Institute at King's College London. He told me we know the ages of the men and where they were arrested, but little else.
The 3 individuals are detained at the moment under relatively new legislation. It's a national security legislation that was brought in, I think, a couple of years ago. And so at the moment, they're accused under the new legislation as undertaking espionage for China, but no details about when, where, how they did this. I mean, I guess that's reasonable enough because the evidence is probably being gathered at the moment. Their houses are, I believe, being searched. The background to this is that last year, 2 other young British people, one was a researcher in Parliament and one was actually an English teacher working in China, were accused of espionage under old legislation, which is now no longer in place. And that case did not go to trial because of lack of evidence. And so this new case, there's a lot of pressure because, of course, the expectation is if this doesn't go through, then why are these sort of cases being brought forward when they're not, they're not proceeded on?
Kerry, briefly remind us of the difference between this new security law and the old one.
The old law was from 1911 and it had very vague definitions of enemy state. And so it was kind of very, very broad brush, quite a brief law. The new law is much more detailed. It talks about specific examples of what might constitute a threat to national security, and it kind of takes into account developments in technology and things like this. So it's a much more extensive law and a kind of up-to-date law.
There have been several investigations, as you say, into Chinese espionage. How is this latest round different, and how does it follow any pattern?
Well, it is different because of its links directly with members of parliament. It's also difficult in terms of timing because the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, went to China at the end of January this year. And also the new embassy, a huge new embassy for China, has been approved in London just before that visit. So for the people who are skeptical about the relationship with China and the kind of new, sort of attempt to reset it, as it were, this will prove to them, well, this isn't something that we should ever do because there'll always be problems. But for others, it's just having to explain, well, it's such an important relationship. We've got to have a kind of, acceptance. Sometimes there are going to be issues. So all around for the sitting government, the Labour government, who are already under a huge amount of pressure in a number of other areas, this is most unwelcome news.
Well, as we've already mentioned, one of those arrested is the spouse of a sitting member of parliament, a Labour MP. Can you talk about what possible significance that has and what alarm that has raised in the British government today?
So the MP has said categorically she has no connections with China, has never met any Chinese business people, and has no links with China. And she has no reason to believe her partner, has any connection. So it is, on the surface, very mysterious, very strange. Of course, as an MP for the Labour Party, even though she doesn't have any position related to international relations or China specifically, there would be the claim that she would at least potentially kind of have maybe material or be in discussions which might relate to government policy. So I'm sure that there will be kind of speculation about that. But at the moment, we just don't know.
Do the arrests offer any insight in what kind of espionage Beijing was hoping these alleged assets were going to produce for China?
It's difficult to get real clarity on this, and necessarily espionage is about things you're not finding a great deal of clarity about. So that's not strange. But I mean, I think that China itself, its core interests in Britain are largely, our membership of NATO, the fact that we're on the UN Permanent Five. It is interested in things that relate to our policy on Taiwan, on Tibet, on Hong Kong. But it's not so interested, I think, in our own political processes and, kind of broader issues like that. So, I mean, it's not unlikely that if there are issues, with these individuals, they may well relate in particular to Britain's posture on, security issues that China is interested in.
What are the main concerns in the UK, Kerry, when it comes to Chinese spying? Is it theft of political secrets? Is it industrial or economic secrets?
I think it's a mixture. Hong Kong has been historically a big issue, and 180,000, I believe, Hong Kong individuals have moved to Britain under a special fast track to citizenship since 2021. And, that community in Britain, most people don't engage in political activity, but that there are, certainly plenty of people who left Hong Kong for political reasons. And the claim is that they in particular have been targeted, and their activism and their concerns about Britain's position on Hong Kong have kind of been of interest to either the Chinese security agents themselves or their proxies. I think generally, China has an interest in the finance sector in Britain. In terms of technology, I think that's less interesting now. China has come way ahead on technology and probably has better technology in many ways than Britain now.
You mentioned earlier, Kerry, Prime Minister Keir Starmer's trip to China recently. How would you describe the current state of UK-Chinese relations?
With all the news today, improving in terms of being pragmatic, more kind of stable, kind of really the focus was on securing a better quality, economic relationship, because China is a relatively small investor in Britain and it's our third largest trading partner if you include Hong Kong, but there's still a big surplus in China's favour. With China, Britain always has a difficult relationship. Historically, it's always been a bit turbulent and up and down. We've had downturns before. Today is a bit of a downturn. But I think at the end of the day, there's a lot of common areas where Britain and China work together, from environment to AI, all sorts of areas. So, that will continue no matter what. And with the current turbulent geopolitics, I think Britain understands that China is, a complicated partner, but a necessary one. And I don't imagine for one moment that attitude will change.
Kerry Brown joined us today from King's College London, where he's the director of the Lao China Institute. This is The World. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. Peru has been in a state of emergency due to heavy rains. We will hear more about that in just a moment. But first, some headlines we are following as the war in Iran, waged by the U.S. and Israel, expands and intensifies.
The first Israeli combat casualties so far in this war have been reported. 2 were wounded today by anti-tank fire in southern Lebanon. Also today, the Israel Defense Forces launched 2 waves of strikes on Tehran. The IDF says both waves targeted military assets. Across Israel today, sirens sounded, warning residents of simultaneous missiles from Iran and Lebanon. An Israeli army spokesman said that the IDF has no intelligence indicating that Iran and Hezbollah coordinated the strikes.
Leaders across the globe are under pressure to make their position known on this war. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney said today that he supports the war with regret. French leader Emmanuel Macron has said the U.S.-Israeli strikes that started the war were outside of international law.
Spain has been notably defiant. Our reporter based in Spain covered that earlier today in the show. If you missed it, check it out at theworld.org.
In Peru, people along the Pacific coast are cleaning up from torrential rains. Storms have battered the nation for weeks, and the resulting flooding and landslides have killed dozens and prompted the government to declare a state of emergency in half of Peru's districts. This time of year, rain in the country is normal, but this year's conditions are extreme, with experts pointing to climate change and a local coastal El Niño weather pattern as contributing factors. Scientist Pedro at the University of Engineering and Technology in Lima explained the landslides Peru is seeing now.
Many rivers are dry or seasonally dry. So when the rain arrives in Arequipa city, that is the second largest city here in Peru, all the dry torrents, the dry creeks flood with mud. So all the city was like cut in 2 parts, in the north and southern part in the city.
What do you mean that the city was cut into 2 parts? Was a bridge washed away or something?
Like all the bridges, all the avenues intercept those creeks.
So you couldn't get from one side of the city to the other because all the roads connecting the 2 were flooded?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. The damage in total, it was 85,000 affected people.
Can you just remind us why an El Niño weather pattern brings more rains to Peru?
Well, normally the ocean, the sea, the Peruvian Sea is cold, but when the Niño arrives from the west, the precipitations explode exponentially because the evaporation, the condensation for this temperature occur the rainfall events.
So when the ocean is warmer, more water evaporates from it, and the air can hold more water also when it's warmer. So then you get these heavier deluges. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Here in Peru, we call, for example, the coastal El Niño, and the other one is the global El Niño that generally most countries are monitoring. So the coastal El Niño is very near to our shores, but also the global El Niño that maybe will arrive this year will produce the heavy rains also.
So the El Niño pattern, the coastal El Niño pattern that Peru has said has begun, that is different than the global El Niño pattern that, we here in the U.S. might experience.
Yeah.
Is that right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. Our experts about El Niño here in Peru define it the coastal El Niño condition, that it's changing week by week. Also, it happens very fast in range of days or weeks. So that's the reason that even the country, there is no well prepared sometimes. So yeah, that's Peru really. It's a challenge for us really. Mm-hmm.
I would assume just like the larger global El Niño weather pattern that this coastal El Niño pattern has been around basically forever. But climate change is also heating up oceans. I'm wondering if that is changing what this coastal El Niño phenomenon looks like in Peru and how it impacts people.
Yeah, that's a good question about the coastal El Niño. It's like a very local phenomenon. There is not a lot of instrumentation to monitoring all the conditions. The global warming that we are expecting in those areas, I think we need more research to do. Specifically, there were some events, more frequent events, for example, related to colder conditions and warm conditions. So if you translate this into the rainfall and flood events, also it's in the same way. Maybe rains are more intense now.
We've talked about the damage done by this flooding. What are the recovery efforts that are underway?
Yeah, normally there are the emergency state, and in total there are 14 regions affected. But we need more stabilizations in political views, maybe. No?
More stable politics would allow for better recovery, you're saying?
Yeah, I think, because, we have changed the president the last weeks.
The state of emergency was kind of
normally
delayed because there was no one to call it, right?
It's classic. No one to sign or offices. It's a bit complicated.
Has preparedness for this kind of flooding changed or improved over the years in Peru?
Yeah, every event represents a lesson, so it's a long-term learning. People now realize that there is a reason why not to build near to a river, not invade some terrains near to the river, so near to dry creeks, for example. So there are lots of lessons in those events. But the most, I think, interesting point here is the use of local knowledge. Maybe it's the most representative here in Peru. There is more traditional customs, traditional history here in Peru. So the adaptations, the local knowledge, it's now, I think, important to consider in those plans, in those projects, because it's very related to our culture also.
What does the forecast look like right now?
Yeah, as I mentioned, the coastal El Niño is a bit complicated. It's changing every week. So, we need to be alert. Because the next month, in March or April, that we are still with the rains, so the rains could be exacerbated by those events. So yes, just be alert in our country.
That was Pedro Rao at the University of Engineering and Technology in Lima, Peru.
The World is produced by GBH and PRX, broadcasting weekdays from the Nan and Bill Harris studio in Boston and from the Department of Communication at UC San Diego. Find our ongoing coverage of war in the Middle East at theworld.org. We'll keep bringing you news and analysis as the story unfolds. I'm Marco Werman.
And I'm Carolyn Beeler. Come back again tomorrow, same time, same place.
The World is supported by the Carnegie Corporation of New York, working to reduce political polarization through philanthropic support for education, democracy, and peace. More information at carnegie.org. By the Lumina Foundation, committed to a fair, universal system for learning beyond high school that offers every American the chance for a better life. luminafoundation.org. By the PRX Ambassador Council, whose members include Judy Piggott, the Gruber Family Foundation, the Schmidt Family Foundation, and Gavin Salmonese, LLC. The World's theme music is composed by Ned Porter. The World is a co-production of GBH Boston and PRX.
PRX.